Okay, we'll try this again. So today I'm going to be reading Difference and Repetition by Gilles Deleuze. I'm going to be taking some notes and highlighting some passages. We're going to be reading this in a reading group starting on Thursday at 7:30. You can find information on it on meetup.com for Philosophy 101 in Portland. If you have any other questions, just contact me through the channel. I generally like to have my phone read out loud to me, so I just listen along. I'll show that on the screen so you can see what I'm reading. And again, if you have questions, let me know. If you have any suggestions about how I can make this better or more informative, or if you have methods that you use that are good for studying philosophy, I'd be happy to see those too. Thank you. Okay, well, I'm going to bring up the text. I got tucked away. Let's see. Okay. I'm just going to skip over the prefaces, and we're not going to read the conclusion first, like he suggests that we should. And people did notice that with his other books as well. Okay, so here we are at the introduction. Okay.
Which implies the confusion is regrettable. For example, when we say that two things are as alike as two drops of water, or when we identify, there is only a science of the general with introduction, repetition and difference. Repetition is not generality. Repetition and generality must be distinguished in several ways. Every formula which implies the confusion is regrettable. For example, when we say that two things are as alike as two drops of water, or when we identify, there is only a science of the general with there is only a science of that which is repeated. Repetition and resemblance are different in kind, extremely so. Generality presents two major orders, the qualitative order of resemblances and the quantitative order of equivalences. Cycles and equalities are their respective symbols. But in any case, generality expresses a point of view according to which one term may be exchanged or substituted for another. The exchange or substitution of particulars defines our conduct in relation to generality. That is why the empiricists are not wrong to present general ideas as particular ideas in themselves, so long as they add the belief that each of these can be replaced by any other particular idea which resembles it in relation to a given word. By contrast, we can see that repetition is a necessary and justified conduct only in relation to that which cannot be replaced. Repetition as a conduct and as a point of view concerns non-exchangeable and non-substitutable singularities. Reflections, echoes, doubles and souls do not belong to the domain of resemblance or equivalence, and it is no more possible to exchange one's soul than it is to substitute real twins for one another. If exchange is the criterion of generality, theft and gift are those of repetition. There is, therefore, an economic difference between the two. To repeat is to behave in a certain manner, but in relation to something unique or singular which has no equal or equivalent. And perhaps this repetition at the level of external conduct echoes, for its own part, a more secret vibration which animates it. A more profound, internal repetition within the singular. This is the apparent paradox of festivals, they repeat an unrepeatable. They do not add a second and a third time to the first, but carry the first time to the nth power. With respect to this power, repetition interiorizes and thereby reverses itself, as Peggy says. It is not Federation Day which commemorates or represents the fall of the Bastille. but the fall of the Bastille, which celebrates and repeats in advance all the Federation days, or Monnet's first water lily, which repeats all the others. Point 1. Generality. As generality of the particular. Thus stands opposed to repetition as universality of the singular. The repetition of a work of art is like a singularity without concept. And it is not by chance that a poem must be 2. Difference and repetition. Learned by heart. The head is the organ of exchange. But the heart is the amorous organ of repetition. It is true that repetition also concerns the head. But precisely because it is its terror or paradox. Pius Servian rightly distinguished 2 languages, the language of science, dominated by the symbol of equality, in which each term may be replaced by others, and lyrical language, in which every term is irreplaceable and can only be repeated. Repetition can always be represented as extreme resemblance or perfect equivalence. But the fact that one can pass by degrees from one thing to another does not prevent the being different in kind. On the other hand, generality belongs to the order of laws. However, law determines only the resemblance of the subjects ruled by it, along with their equivalence to terms which it designates. Far from grounding repetition, law shows, rather, how repetition would remain impossible for pure subjects of law particulars. It condemns them to change, as an empty form of difference, an invariable form of variation. A law compels its subjects to illustrate it only at the cost of their own change. No doubt there are as many constants as variables among the terms designated by laws, and as many permanences and perseverations as there are fluxes and variations in nature. However, a perseveration is still not a repetition. The constants of one law are in turn variables of a more general law. Just as the hardest rocks become soft and fluid matter on the geological scale of millions of years, so at each level, it is in relation to large, permanent natural objects that the subject of a law experiences its own powerlessness to repeat and discovers that this powerlessness is already contained in the object, reflected in the permanent object wherein it sees itself condemned. Law unites the change of the water and the permanence of the river. Gilles Fauré said of Watteau, he imbued with the utmost transitoriness those things which our gaze encounters as the most enduring, namely space and forests. This is the 18th century method. Walmart, in La Nouvelle Heloise, made a system of it the impossibility of repetition, and change as a general condition to which all particular creatures are subject by the law of nature, were understood in relation to fixed terms themselves. No doubt, variables in relation to other permanences and in function of other, more general laws. This is the meaning of the grove, the grotto and the sacred object. Saint Pro learns that he cannot repeat, not only because of his own change and that of Julie, but also because of the great natural permanences, which assume a symbolic value and exclude him no less from true repetition. If repetition is possible, it is due to miracle rather than to law. It is against the law, against the similar form and the equivalent content of law. If repetition can be found, even in nature, it is in the name of a power which affirms itself against the law, which works underneath laws, perhaps superior to laws. If repetition exists, it expresses at once a singularity opposed to the general, a universality opposed to the particular, a distinctive opposed to the ordinary, an instantaneity opposed to variation, repetition and difference E3, and an eternity opposed to permanence. In every respect, repetition is a transgression. It puts law into question. It denounces its nominal or general character in favor of a more profound and more artistic reality. From the point of view of scientific experiment, it seems difficult to deny a relationship between repetition and law. However, we must ask under what conditions experimentation ensures repetition. Natural phenomena are produced in a free state, where any inference is possible among the vast cycles of resemblance. In this sense, everything reacts on everything else, and everything resembles everything else, resemblance of the diverse with itself. However, Experimentation constitutes relatively closed environments in which phenomena are defined in terms of a small number of chosen factors, a minimum of 2, for example, space and time for the movement of bodies in a vacuum. Consequently, there is no reason to question the application of mathematics to physics. Physics is already mathematical. Since the closed environments or chosen factors also constitute systems of geometrical coordinates. In these conditions, phenomena necessarily appear as equal to a certain quantitative relation between the chosen factors. Experimentation is thus a matter of substituting one order of generality for another, an order of equality for an order of resemblance. Resemblances are unpacked in order to discover an equality which allows the identification of a phenomenon under the particular conditions of the experiment. Repetition appears here only in the passage from one order of generality to another, emerging with the help of, or on the occasion of, this passage. It is as if repetition momentarily appeared between or underneath the two generalities. Here too, however, there is a risk of mistaking a difference in kind for a difference of degree. For generality only represents and presupposes a hypothetical repetition. Given the same circumstances, then, this formula says that in similar situations one will always be able to select and retain the same factors, which represent the being equal of the phenomena. This, however, does not account for what gives rise to repetition, nor for what is categorical or important for repetition in principle. What is important in principle is, in times, as the power of a single time, without the need to pass through a second or a third time. In its essence, repetition refers to a singular power which differs in kind from generality, even when, in order to appear, it takes advantage of the artificial passage from one order of generality to another. Expecting repetition from the law of nature is the Stoic error. The wise must be converted into the virtuous. The dream of finding a law which would make repetition possible passes over to the moral sphere. There is always a task to recommence, a fidelity to be revived within a daily life indistinguishable from the reaffirmation of duty. Buckner makes Danton say, "For difference and repetition, it is so wearisome. First you put on your shirt, then your trousers, you drag yourself into bed at night and in the morning drag yourself out again, and always you put one foot in front of the other. There is little hope that it will ever change. Millions have always done it like that and millions more will do so after us. Moreover, since we're made up of two halves which both do the same thing, everything's done twice. It's all very boring and very, very sad. Point 3. However, what good is moral law if it does not sanctify reiteration? Above all, if it does not make reiteration possible and give us a legislative power from which we are excluded by the law of nature. Moralists sometimes present the categories of good and evil in the following manner: every time we try to repeat according to nature or as natural beings repetition of a pleasure, of a past, of a passion, we throw ourselves into a demonic and already damned exercise which can end only in despair or boredom. The good, by contrast, holds out the possibility of repetition, of successful repetition and of the spirituality of repetition, because it depends not upon a law of nature but on a law of duty, of which, as moral beings, we cannot be subjects without also being legislators. What is Kant's highest test, if not a criterion which should decide what can in principle be reproduced? In other words, what can be repeated without contradiction in the form of moral law? The man of duty invented a test of repetition. He decided what in principle could be repeated. He thought he had thereby defeated both the demonic and the wearisome. Moreover, as an echo of Danton's concerns or a response to them, is there not a moralism in that repetition apparatus described with such precision by Kant's biographers, right down to the astonishing garters that he made for himself, and the regularity of his daily promenades, in the sense that neglecting one's toilet and missing exercise are among those conducts whose maxim cannot, without contradiction, be regarded as a universal law, nor, therefore, be the object of rightful repetition. Conscience, however, suffers from the following ambiguity: it can be conceived only by supposing the moral law to be external, superior and indifferent to the natural law, but the application of the moral law can be conceived only by restoring to conscience itself the image and the model of the law of nature. As a result, the moral law, far from giving us true repetition, still leaves us in generality. This time, the generality is not that of nature but that of habit as a second nature. It is useless to point to the existence of a moral or bad habits, it is the form of habit, or, as Bergson used to say, the habit of acquiring habits, the whole of obligation, which is essentially moral or has the form of the good. Furthermore, in this whole or generality of habit we again find the two major orders, that of resemblance, in the variable conformity of the elements of action with a given model insofar as the habit has not been acquired, and that of repetition and differing E5. Equivalence, with the equality of the elements of action in different situations once the habit has been acquired. As a result, habit never gives rise to true repetition. Sometimes the action changes and is perfected while the intention remains constant, sometimes the action remains the same in different contexts and with different intentions. There again, if repetition is possible, it would appear only between or beneath the two generalities of perfection and integration, testifying to the presence of a quite different power. At the risk of overturning these two generalities, if repetition is possible, it is as much opposed to moral law as it is to natural law. There are two known ways to overturn moral law. One is by ascending towards the principles, challenging the law as secondary, derived, borrowed or general, denouncing it as involving a second-hand principle which diverts an original force or usurps an original power. The other way, by contrast, is to overturn the law by descending towards the consequences, to which one submits with a too perfect attention to detail. By adopting the law, a falsely submissive soul manages to evade it and to taste pleasures it was supposed to forbid. We can see this in demonstration by absurdity and working to rule, but also in some forms of masochistic behavior which mock by submission. The first way of overturning the law is ironic, where irony appears as an art of principles, of ascent towards the principles and of overturning principles. The second is humor, which is an art of consequences and descents, of suspensions and falls. Must we understand that repetition appears in both this suspense and this ascent? As though existence recommenced and reiterated itself once it is no longer constrained by laws. Repetition belongs to humor and irony, it is by nature transgression or exception, always revealing a singularity opposed to the particulars subsumed under laws, a universal opposed to the generalities which give rise to laws. There is a force common to Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. Hegel would have to be added in order to form the triptych of priest, Antichrist and Catholic. Each of the three, in his own way, makes repetition not only a power peculiar to language and thought, a superior pathos and pathology, but also the fundamental category of a philosophy of the future. To each corresponds a testament as well as a theater, a conception of the theater, and a hero of repetition as a principal character in this theater, Job Abraham, Dionysos Zarathustra, Joan of Arc, Cleo. What separates them is considerable, evident and well known. But nothing can hide this prodigious encounter in relation to a philosophy of repetition. They oppose repetition to all forms of generality. Nor do they take the word repetition in a metaphorical sense. On the contrary, they have a way of taking it literally and of introducing it into the style. We can, or rather, must, first of all list the principal propositions which indicate the points on which they coincide. 6. Difference and repetition. 1. Make something new of repetition itself, connect it with a test. With a selection or selective test, make it the supreme object of the will and of freedom. Kierkegaard specifies that it is not a matter of drawing something new from repetition, of extracting something new from it. Only contemplation or the mind which contemplates from without extracts. It is rather a matter of acting, of making repetition as such a novelty, that is, a freedom and a task of freedom. In the case of Nietzsche, liberate the will from everything which binds it by making repetition the very object of willing. No doubt it is repetition which already binds, but if we die of repetition we are also saved and healed by it, healed. Above all, by the other repetition. The whole mystical game of loss and salvation is therefore contained in repetition. Along with the whole theatrical game of life and death and the whole positive game of illness and health, cf. Zarathustra ill and Zarathustra convalescent by virtue of one and the same power which is that of repetition in the eternal return. 2. In consequence, oppose repetition to the laws of nature. Kierkegaard declares that he does not speak at all of repetition in nature, of cycles and seasons, exchanges and equalities. Furthermore, if repetition concerns the most interior element of the will, this is because everything changes around the will, in accordance with the law of nature. According to the law of nature, repetition is impossible. For this reason, Kierkegaard condemns as aesthetic repetition every attempt to obtain repetition from the laws of nature by identifying with the legislative principle. Whether in the Epicurean or the Stoic manner, it will be said that the situation is not so clear with Nietzsche. Nietzsche's declarations are nevertheless explicit. If he discovers repetition in the physis itself, this is because he discovers in the physis something superior to the reign of laws, a will willing itself through all change. A power opposed to law. An interior of the earth opposed to the laws of its surface. Nietzsche opposes his hypothesis to the cyclical hypothesis. He conceives of repetition in the eternal return as being, but he opposes this being to every legal form, to the being similar as much as to the being equal. How could the thinker who goes furthest in criticizing the notion of law reintroduce eternal return as a law of nature? How could such a connoisseur of the Greeks be justified in regarding his own thought as prodigious and new? If he were content to formulate that natural platitude, that generality regarding nature well known to the ancients. On 2 occasions, Zarathustra corrects erroneous interpretations of the eternal return, with anger directed at his demon, spirit of gravity. Do not treat this too lightly, with kindness directed at his animals, O buffoons and barrel organs. You have already made a refrain out of it. The refrain is the eternal return as cycle or circulation, as being similar and being equal, in short, as natural animal certitude and as sensible law of nature. 3. Oppose repetition to moral law, to the point where it becomes the suspension of ethics. A thought beyond good and evil. Repetition appears. Repetition and different E1, as the logos of the solitary and the singular, the logos of the private thinker. Both Kierkegaard and Nietzsche developed the opposition between the private thinker, the thinker comet and bearer of repetition, and the public professor and doctor of law, whose second-hand discourse proceeds by mediation and finds its moralizing source in the generality of concepts, cf. Kierkegaard against Hegel, Nietzsche against Kant and Hegel, and from this point of view, Hegel against the Sorbonne. Job is infinite contestation and Abraham infinite resignation. But these are one and the same thing. Job challenges the law in an ironic manner, refusing all second-hand explanations and dismissing the general in order to reach the most singular as principle or as universal. Abraham submits humorously to the law, but finds in that submission precisely the singularity of his only son whom the law commanded him to sacrifice. As Kierkegaard understands it, repetition is the transcendent correlate shared by the psychical intentions of contestation and resignation. We rediscover the two aspects in Pegai's doubling of Joan of Arc and Gervais. In Nietzsche's striking atheism, hatred of the law and amor fati, love of fate. Aggression and acquiescence are the two faces of Zarathustra, gathered from the Bible and turned back against it. Further, in a certain sense one can see Zarathustra's moral test of repetition as competing with Kant. The eternal return says whatever you will it in such a manner that you also will its eternal return. There is a formalism here which overturns Kant on his own ground. A test which goes further since, instead of relating repetition to a supposed moral law, it seems to make repetition itself the only form of a law beyond morality. In reality, however, things are even more complicated. The form of repetition in the eternal return is the brutal form of the immediate, that of the universal and the singular reunited, which dethrones every general law, dissolves the mediations and annihilates the particulars subjected to the law, just as irony and black humor are combined in Zarathustra. So there is a within the law and a beyond the law united in the eternal return. 4. Oppose repetition not only to the generalities of habit but also to the particularities of memory. For it is perhaps habit which manages to draw something new from a repetition contemplated from without. With habit, we act only on the condition that there is a little self within us which contemplates, it is this which extracts the new, in other words, the general, from the pseudo-repetition of particular cases. Memory, then, perhaps recovers the particulars dissolved in generality. These psychological movements are of little consequence, for both Nietzsche and Kierkegaard they fade away in the face of repetition proposed as the double condemnation of habit and memory. In this way, repetition is the thought of the future, it is opposed to both the ancient category of reminiscence and the modern category of habitus. It is in repetition and by repetition that forgetting becomes a positive power while the unconscious becomes a 8 difference and repetition. Positive and superior unconscious, for example. Forgetting as a force is an integral part of the lived experience of eternal return. Everything is summed up in power. When Kierkegaard speaks of repetition as the second power of consciousness, second means not a second time but the infinite which belongs to a single time. The eternity which belongs to an instant. The unconscious which belongs to consciousness, the nth power. And when Nietzsche presents the eternal return as the immediate expression of the will to power. Will to power does not at all mean to want power, but, on the contrary, whatever you will, carry it to the nth power, in other words. Separate out the superior form by virtue of the selective operation of thought in the eternal return. By virtue of the singularity of repetition in the eternal return itself. Here, in the superior form of everything that is we, find the immediate identity of the eternal return and the overman. We are not suggesting any resemblance whatsoever between Nietzsche's Dionysus and Kierkegaard's God. On the contrary, we believe that the difference is insurmountable. But this is all the more reason to ask why the coincidence concerning this fundamental objective, the theme of repetition, even though they understand this objective differently. Kierkegaard and Nietzsche are among those who bring to philosophy new means of expression. In relation to them we speak readily of an overcoming of philosophy. Furthermore, in all their work movement is at issue. Their objection to Hegel is that he does not go beyond false movement, in other words, the abstract logical movement of mediation. They want to put metaphysics in motion, in action. They want to make it act, and make it carry out immediate acts. It is not enough, therefore, for them to propose a new representation of movement. Representation is already mediation. Rather, it is a question of producing within the work a movement capable of affecting the mind outside of all representation. It is a question of making movement itself a work. Without interposition, of substituting direct signs for mediate representations, of inventing vibrations, rotations, whirlings, gravitations, dances or leaps which directly touch the mind. This is the idea of a man of the theater. The idea of a director before his time. In this sense, something completely new begins with Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. They no longer reflect on the theater in the Hegelian manner. Neither do they set up a philosophical theater. They invent an incredible equivalent of theater within philosophy, thereby founding simultaneously this theater of the future and a new philosophy. It will be said that, at least from the point of view of theater, there was no production, neither the profession of priest in Copenhagen around 1840, nor the break with Wagner and Bayreuth was a favorable condition. One thing, however, is certain when Kierkegaard speaks of ancient theatre and modern drama. The environment has already changed, we are no longer in the element of reflection. We find here a thinker who lives the problem of masks, who experiences the inner emptiness of masks and seeks to fill it too. 9. Repetition and difference. Complete it, albeit with the absolutely different, that is, by putting into it all the difference between the finite and the infinite, thereby creating the idea of a theatre of humor and of faith. When Kierkegaard explains that the knight of faith so resembles a bourgeois in his Sunday best as to be capable of being mistaken for one, this philosophical instruction must be taken as the remark of a director showing how the knight of faith should be played. And when he comments on Job or Abraham, when he imagines the variations of Agnes and the Triton, he rewrites the tale in a manner which is clearly that of a scenario. Mozart's music resonates even in Abraham and Job, it is a matter of leaping to the tune of this music. I look only at movements is the language of a director who poses the highest theatrical problem. The problem of a movement which would directly touch the soul, which would be that of the soul. Even more so with Nietzsche. The birth of tragedy is not a reflection on ancient theatre so much as the practical foundation of a theatre of the future. The opening up of a path along which Nietzsche still thinks it possible to push Wagner. The break with Wagner is not a matter of theory, nor of music, it concerns the respective roles of text, history, noise, music, light, song, dance and decor in this theatre of which Nietzsche dreams. Zarathustra incorporates the two attempts at dramatizing empedocles. Moreover, if Bizet is better than Wagner, it is from the point of view of theatre and for Zarathustra's dances. Nietzsche's reproach to Wagner is that he inverted and distorted movement, giving us a nautical theatre in which we must paddle and swim rather than one in which we can walk and dance. Zarathustra is conceived entirely within philosophy, but also entirely for the stage. Everything in it is scored and visualized, put in motion and made to walk or dance. How can it be read without searching for the exact sound of the cries of the higher man? How can the prologue be read without staging the episode of the tightrope walker which opens the whole story? At certain moments, it is a comic opera about terrible things. And it is not by chance that Nietzsche speaks of the comic character of the overman. Remember the song of Ariadne from the mouth of the old sorcerer, here. Two masks are superimposed, that of a young woman, almost of a core, which has just been laid over the mask of a repugnant old man. The actor must play the role of an old man playing the role of the core. Here too, for Nietzsche, it is a matter of filling the inner emptiness of the mask within a theatrical space by multiplying the superimposed masks and inscribing the omnipresence of Dionysus in that superimposition. By inserting both the infinity of real movement and the form of the absolute difference given in the repetition of eternal return. When Nietzsche says that the overman resembles Borgia rather than Parsifal, or when he suggests that the overman belongs at once to both the Jesuit order and the Prussian officer corps, we can understand these texts only by taking them, 10 difference and repetition, for what they are, the remarks of a director indicating how the overman should be played. Theatre is real movement, and it extracts real movement from all the arts it employs. This is what we are told, this movement, the essence and the inferiority of movement, is not opposition, not mediation, but repetition. Hegel is denounced as the one who proposes an abstract movement of concepts instead of a movement of the physis and the psyche. Hegel substitutes the abstract relation of the particular to the concept in general for the true relation of the singular and the universal in the idea. He thus remains in the reflected element of representation. Within simple generality, he represents concepts instead of dramatizing ideas, he creates a false theater, a false drama, a false movement. We must see how Hegel betrays and distorts the immediate in order to ground his dialectic in that incomprehension, and to introduce mediation in a movement which is no more than that of his own thought and its generalities. When we say, on the contrary, that movement is repetition and that this is our true theater, we are not speaking of the effort of the actor who repeats because he has not yet learned the part. We have in mind the theatrical space, the emptiness of that space, and the manner in which it is filled and determined by the signs and masks through which the actor plays a role which plays other roles. We think of how repetition is woven from one distinctive point to another, including the differences within itself. When Marx also criticizes the abstract false movement or mediation of the Hegelians, he finds himself drawn to an idea, which he indicates rather than develops, an essentially theatrical idea to the extent that history is theater. Then repetition, along with the tragic and the comic within repetition, forms a condition of movement under which the actors, or the heroes, produce something effectively new in history. The theater of repetition is opposed to the theater of representation, just as movement is opposed to the concept and to representation which refers it back to the concept. In the theater of repetition, we experience pure forces, dynamic lines in space which act without intermediary upon the spirit, and link it directly with nature and history, with a language which speaks before words, with gestures which develop before organized bodies, with masks before faces, with specters and phantoms before characters, the whole apparatus of repetition as a terrible power. It then becomes easy to speak of the differences between Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. Even this question, however, must no longer be posed at the speculative level of the ultimate nature of the God of Abraham or the Dionysus of Zarathustra. It is rather a matter of knowing what it means to produce movement, to repeat or to obtain repetition. Is it a matter of leaping, as Kierkegaard believes? Or is it rather a matter of dancing, as Nietzsche thinks? He does not like the confusion of dancing and leaping, only Zarathustra's ape. His demon, his dwarf, his buffoon, leaps. 11. Repetition and difference. Kierkegaard offers us a theater of faith, he opposes spiritual movement. The movement of faith to logical movement. He can thus invite us to go beyond all aesthetic repetition, beyond irony and even humor, all the while painfully aware that he offers us only the aesthetic, ironic and humoristic image of such a going beyond. With Nietzsche, it is a theater of unbelief, of movement as physis, already a theater of cruelty. Here, humor and irony are indispensable and fundamental operations of nature. And what would eternal return be, if we forgot that it is a vertiginous movement endowed with a force, not one which causes the return of the same in general, but one which selects, one which expels as well as creates, destroys as well as produces. Nietzsche's leading idea is to ground the repetition in eternal return on both the death of God and the dissolution of the self. However, it is a quite different alliance in the theater of faith. Kierkegaard dreams of an alliance between a God and a self rediscovered. All sorts of differences follow. Is the movement in the sphere of the mind, or in the entrails of the earth which knows neither God nor self? Where will it be better protected against generalities, against mediations? Is repetition supernatural, to the extent that it is over and above the laws of nature? Or is it rather the most natural will of nature in itself and willing itself as physis? Because nature is by itself superior to its own kingdoms and its own laws. Has Kierkegaard not mixed all kinds of things together in his condemnation of aesthetic repetition, a pseudo-repetition attributable to general laws of nature and a true repetition in nature itself? A pathological repetition of the passions and a repetition in art and the work of art. We cannot now resolve any of these problems. It has been enough for us to find theatrical confirmation of an irreducible difference between generality and repetition. Repetition and generality are opposed from the point of view of conduct and from the point of view of law. It remains to specify a third opposition from the point of view of concepts or representation. Let us pose a question: quid juris? A concept may be in principle the concept of a particular existing thing, thus having an infinite comprehension. Infinite comprehension is the correlate of an extension equals 1. It is very important that this infinity of comprehension be supposed actual, not virtual or simply indefinite. It is on this condition that predicates in the form of moments of concepts are preserved, and have an effect on the subject to which they are attributed. Infinite comprehension thus makes possible remembering and recognition, memory and self-consciousness, even when these two faculties are not themselves infinite. The relation of a concept to its object under this double aspect, in the form that it assumes in this memory and this self-consciousness, is called representation. From this may be drawn the principles of a vulgarized Leibnizianism, according to a principle of difference. 12 Difference and repetition. Every determination is conceptual in the last instance, or actually belongs to the comprehension of a concept, according to a principle of sufficient reason. There is always one concept per particular thing, according to the reciprocal principle of the identity of indiscernibles. There is one and only one thing per concept. Together, these principles expound a theory of difference as conceptual difference, or develop the account of representation as mediation. However, a concept can always be blocked at the level of each of its determinations or each of the predicates that it includes, insofar as it serves as a determination. A predicate must remain fixed in the concept while becoming something else in the thing. Animal becomes something other in man and in horse, humanity something other in Peter and in Paul. This is why the comprehension of the concept is infinite, having become other in the thing. The predicate is like the object of another predicate in the concept. But this is also why each determination remains general or defines a resemblance, to the extent that it remains fixed in the concept and applicable by right to an infinity of things. Here, the concept is thus constituted in such a fashion that, in its real use, its comprehension extends to infinity, but in its logical use, this comprehension is always liable to an artificial blockage. Every logical limitation of the comprehension of a concept endows it with an extension greater than one, in principle infinite, and thus of a generality such that no existing individual can correspond to it. Hic nunc, rule of the inverse relation of comprehension and extension. Thus, the principle of difference understood as difference in the concept does not oppose but, on the contrary, allows the greatest space possible for the apprehension of resemblances, even from the point of view of conundrums. The question what difference is there may always be transformed into what resemblance is there, but above all, in classification, the determination of species implies and supposes a continual evaluation of resemblances. Undoubtedly, resemblance is not a partial identity, but that is only because the predicate in the concept is not, by virtue of its becoming other in the thing, a part of that thing. We wish to indicate the difference between this type of artificial blockage and a quite different type which must be called a natural blockage of the concept. One refers to logic pure and simple, but the other refers to a transcendental logic or a dialectic of existence. Let us suppose that a concept, taken at a particular moment when its comprehension is finite, is forcibly assigned a place in space and time, that is, an existence corresponding normally to the extension equals 1. We would say, then, that a genus or species passes into existence hic nunc without any augmentation of comprehension. There is a rift between that extension equals 1, imposed upon the concept, and the extension equals 8 that it's weak. Comprehension demands in principle. The result will be a discrete extension, that is, a pullulation of individuals absolutely identical in 13. Repetition and difference, respect of the concept, and participating in the same singularity in existence, the paradox of doubles or twins. This phenomenon of discrete extension implies a natural blockage of the concept. Different in kind from a logical blockage, it forms a true repetition in existence rather than an order of resemblance in thought. There is a significant difference between generality, which always designates a logical power of concepts, and repetition, which testifies to the powerlessness or their real limits. Repetition is the pure fact of a concept with finite comprehension being forced to pass as such into existence. Can we find examples of such a passage? Epicurean atoms would be 1, individuals localized in space. They nevertheless have a meager comprehension, which is made up for in discrete extension, to the point where there exists an infinity of atoms of the same shape and size. The existence of Epicurean atoms may be doubted. On the other hand, the existence of words, which are in a sense linguistic atoms, cannot be doubted. Words possess a comprehension which is necessarily finite, since they are by nature the objects of a merely nominal definition. We have here a reason why the comprehension of the concept cannot extend to infinity. We define a word by only a finite number of words. Nevertheless, speech and writing, from which words are inseparable, give them an existence hic nunc, a genus thereby passes into existence as such, and here again extension is made up for in dispersion, in discreteness, under the sign of a repetition which forms the real power of language in speech and writing. The question is, are there other natural blockages besides those of discrete extension and finite comprehension? Let us assume a concept with indefinite comprehension, virtually infinite. However far one pursues that comprehension, one can always think that it subsumes perfectly identical objects. By contrast with the actual infinite, where the concept is sufficient by right to distinguish its object from every other object. In this case the concept can pursue its comprehension indefinitely, always subsuming a plurality of objects which is itself indefinite. Here again, the concept is the same, indefinitely the same, for objects which are distinct. We must therefore recognize the existence of non-conceptual differences between these objects. It is Kant who best indicates the correlation between objects endowed with only an indefinite specification and purely spatio-temporal, or oppositional, non-conceptual determinations, the paradox of symmetrical objects. However, these determinations are precisely only the figures of repetition. Space and time are themselves repetitive milieu. And real opposition is not a maximum of difference but a minimum of repetition, a repetition reduced to 2. Echoing and returning on itself, a repetition which has found the means to define itself. Repetition thus appears as difference without a concept. Repetition which escapes indefinitely continued conceptual difference. It expresses a power peculiar to the existent, a stubbornness of the existent in intuition, which resists 14 difference and repetition. Every specification by concepts, no matter how far this is taken, however far you go in the concept. Kant says, you can always repeat, that is, make several objects correspond to it. Or at least 2, one for the left and one for the right. One for the more and one for the less. One for the positive and one for the negative. Such a situation may be better understood if we consider that concepts with indefinite comprehension are concepts of nature. As such, they are always in something else, they are not in nature but in the mind which contemplates it or observes it, and represents it to itself. That is why it is said that nature is alienated mind or alienated concept. Opposed to itself, corresponding to such concepts are those objects which themselves lack memory, that is, which neither possess nor collect in themselves their own moments. The question is asked why nature repeats, because it is parts extra parts. Mens momentaneer. Novelty then passes to the mind which represents itself, because the mind has a memory or acquires habits. It is capable of forming concepts in general and of drawing something new, of subtracting something new from the repetition that it contemplates. Concepts with finite comprehension are nominal concepts. Concepts with indefinite comprehension but without memory are concepts of nature. Yet these two cases still do not exhaust the examples of natural blockage. Take an individual notion or a particular representation with infinite comprehension, endowed with memory but lacking self-consciousness. The comprehensive representation is indeed in itself. The memory is there, embracing all the particularity of an act, a scene, an event or a being. What is missing, however, for a determinate natural reason, is the for itself of consciousness or recognition. What is missing in the memory is remembrance, or rather, the working through of memory. Consciousness establishes between the I and the representation a relation much more profound than that which appears in the expression, I have a representation. It relates the representation to the I as if to a free faculty which does not allow itself to be confined within any one of its products, but for which each product is already thought and recognized as past. The occasion of a determinant change in inner meaning, when the consciousness of knowledge or the working through of memory is missing. The knowledge in itself is only the repetition of its object, it is played. That is to say repeated, enacted instead of being known. Repetition here appears as the unconscious of the free concept of knowledge or of memory, the unconscious of representation. It fell to Freud to assign the natural reason for such a blockage, repression or resistance, which makes repetition itself a veritable constraint, a compulsion. Here, then, is a third case of blockage, one which concerns, this time, the concepts of freedom. Here too, from the standpoint of a certain Freudianism, we can discover the principle of an inverse relation between repetition and consciousness. Repetition and remembering. Repetition and recognition, the paradox of the 15. Repetition and difference. Burials, or buried objects, the less one remembers, the less one is conscious of remembering one's past. The more one repeats it, remember and work through the memory in order not to repeat it. Self-consciousness in recognition appears as the faculty of the future or the function of the future, the function of the new. Is it not true that the only dead who return are those whom one has buried too quickly and too deeply, without paying them the necessary respects? And that remorse testifies less to an excess of memory than to a powerlessness or to a failure in the working through of a memory. There is a tragic and a comic repetition. Indeed, repetition always appears twice, once in the tragic destiny and once in the comic aspect. In the theater, the hero repeats precisely because he is separated from an essential, infinite knowledge. This knowledge is in him. It is immersed in him and acts in him, but acts like something hidden, like a blocked representation. The difference between the comic and the tragic pertains to two elements. First, the nature of the repressed knowledge, in the one case immediate natural knowledge, a simple given of common sense, in the other terrible esoteric knowledge. Second, as a result, the manner in which the character is excluded from this knowledge, the manner in which he does not know that he knows. In general, the practical problem consists in this unknown knowledge must be represented as bathing the whole scene, impregnating all the elements of the play and comprising in itself all the powers of mind and nature. But at the same time the hero cannot represent it to himself, on the contrary. He must enact it, play it and repeat it until the acute moment that Aristotle called recognition. At this point, repetition and representation confront one another and merge, without, however, confusing the two levels, the one reflecting itself in and being sustained by the other, the knowledge as it is represented on stage and as repeated by the actor then being recognized as the same.
Okay. Well, that took us through the first 15 pages of the introduction of difference and repetition. I'm going to go back through the highlights that I've made and try to type up some notes. I'm not going to do it right now, but pretty soon. So, and then we'll keep going and see how we like this book. If you have questions, please let me know.